Introduction to Singe, Memoli, and Carlson's MAPPER algorithm. MAPPER was described in their 2007 paper, Topological Methods for the Analysis of High-Dimensional Datasets and 3D Object Recognition. We will use the introductory example in the Lum et al. Paper, Extracting Insights from the Shape of Complex Data Using Topology. The idea behind MAPPER is to take a data set and output a graph that represents the data set. So for example, if we've got data covering a three-dimensional hand, we can create a graph that represents that three-dimensional hand using the software MAPPER. So again, the input is the data set and the output is a graph representing the data set. And the graph will be created by using overlapping bins as we describe in detail. So you start off with a data set. In this example, it's a point cloud data representing a hand, so you have a bunch of points covering a three-dimensional hand. We then will color this data set using a filter function. In this example, we are going to project to the first coordinate. So we will take points here and then just project them down to their x coordinate. So a point gets us projected down to the first coordinate. Thus, we can color our data set using our filter function. So for example, if I take this green point right here, its pre-image is all of this, so they get colored green. We use this to create overlapping bins. So that was our goal, is to create these overlapping bins. So for example, I can cover my real line. So we've got this real line here. I'll cover it with a bunch of overlapping open intervals. And then I can take the pre-image of this overlapping interval, pre-image of this open interval to create this bin right here. So all the data in the pre-image of this open interval gets placed into a single bin. We can also take the pre-image of this open interval right here, and we get all the data sets into here. That becomes another bin. Similarly, we can take the pre-image of this open interval. That pre-image gives us the data points in this rectangle right here. So all the data sets, all the data points within this thing, that also gets placed into a single bin. So we bin by filter value, taking our overlapping, taking all these bins, and notice that they are overlapping. So if I take this red bin here, that corresponds to this. And an important point to note is that there are points in common between these. So there are these points that are in the intersection. So some of these points here are also over here. Some of these points here are also over here. Some of these points here are also over here. So the idea behind MAPPER is to bin the data into overlapping bins, so the bins do intersect. Points here are also over here, points here are over here, so we bin the data into several overlapping bins. Once you have each of these bins, we can cluster them. In our case, we will cluster using connected components. So I can see I've got 3 clusters right here in this bin. I can take a look at this next bin. There are going to be 4 clusters right here. If I take a look at the last bin, well, there's just this one cluster over there. Each cluster will be represented by a vertex. So for this bin, remember we had these 3 clusters. For this bin, we had 4 clusters. So each of these clusters we represent using a single vertex. in this bin, we have two connected components. So this component right here, so that gets a vertex. And then we have this component right here, so that gets a vertex. Similarly, in this bin, we have two connected components. It might look like these connect up, but in 3 dimensions, this one right here is a separate component, so it gets its own vertex. And one component in this bin and one component in this bin, so just one vertex. We can then create a network or a graph by creating edges between any two clusters that intersect. So if I take a look at this cluster right here and this cluster right here, we'll remember they overlap. There were some points over here that were also over here. So if these two clusters overlap, so these clusters in the 2 different bins, if they overlap, we draw an edge between them. Similarly, there are points in common with this cluster as with this cluster. So points over here intersect with points over here. They overlapped, and so we get an edge between these two. Similarly, an edge between these two. And points in this cluster intersect with points in this cluster, so we get an edge here. Points in this cluster intersect with points in this cluster. There are points in common between this cluster here, between this cluster right here and this cluster right here. There are points in common, so we get an edge between them. So whenever there are points in common between the 2 clusters, we draw an edge. That gives us a graph that now represents our data set. So the idea, to summarize, is we take our data set, we can color it by filter value and use that to bin our data into overlapping bins. So we create these overlapping bins. Then for each individual bin, we cluster each individual bin, and each cluster is represented by a vertex. So this bin right here, there were 4 clusters, so we get 4 vertices. And then if we take a look at 2 bins and take a look at the clusters within the bins, if there's an intersection between them, if they have points in common, we draw an edge, and that gives us a graph. In the next video, we will take a look at Mapper applied to some specific examples to further illustrate how Mapper works.